this, but there are some concerns that it needs to be revisited, and even the overnight parking may be considered as far as where they can park, not anywhere, but maybe there are certain roadways or certain sides of the street. There are also concerns about the size of vehicles because of safety. Can large vans be parked on the street overnight? If it impedes the line of sight, they felt that was problematic. So we're going to be looking at those issues. The width of the streets, speaking to the safety, a comment was that having parking on both sides of the street in certain areas is restricts vehicular movement, often down to one lane, so cars have to wait for others to pass, and people entering and exiting their vehicle is a safety issue. Rear view mirrors have been knocked off, it was reported, and so we're going to be looking at the width of streets and how that plays into setting on-street parking regulations for that area. It may be convenient right now to have parking on both sides of the street, but it may not be in the best interest from a safety perspective. So we're going to be looking also at the winter on-street parking restrictions. That was something that was brought up, and largely people understood and felt fine about the current restrictions. They just wanted to know as the seasons change and winters get shorter or longer, is there some flexibility in when it begins and when it ends? And so we're going to take a deeper dive into that policy and see if there's any room for calibration on a yearly basis. We also looked at talked to them about an alternative for on-street parking. So residents may be interested in having specifically multi-tenant residents, an area where they can park consistently off the street. And we know that it's not common that in a residential area there's a parking lot available. We work in communities where an older home may have been taken down and they create a parking lot for the community, the neighborhood. But the ones next to that lot aren't very happy with that. They feel it maybe brings down their property value. So it becomes a challenge to identify an off-street parking solution in a neighborhood. Typically we look at schools or churches or land uses that are already woven within the fabric of the community that may have excess supply to be able to accommodate overnight parking for residents. And that gets the vehicles off the street and improves vehicular access as well as safety for the vehicles too, as opposed to not being at risk of being hit by another car. So looking at those issues, we will incorporate the multifamily parking policy. Definitely we're going to, we have information about the residential units within the village and permits per resident, and we're going to be looking at that more closely. I know the tenants of some of the multi-family housing had mentioned that they felt that parking policies were unfair to their, they were looked upon unfairly. Now that's completely an opinion. We want to make sure that we're looking at it just to make sure that it's as equitable, it's rational. We don't want to just have free reign, everybody parking wherever they want. We want to make sure that it's ensuring the best access for all the user groups around those properties, single-family homes, the multi-tenant, as well as the businesses that are located in the area. There's also the residential parking restrictions on narrow roads. I had mentioned that briefly. The two-way traffic is impeded, so that brings up the final issue with the residential parking. multimodal transportation, Steve's going to jump in on this and give you guys a quick update.
Thanks, Bill. So we also had a number of comments and issues brought forward at the multimodal transportation. The first one was schools, and Bill has covered some of those issues that were brought up. Pedestrian crossings, are the flashing lights the right way to go, or crossing locations, what's the loading, pedestrian crossings, and all that stuff. And basically, on the little stickies, every school within the village was mentioned by name. And then one of the interesting side issues that came up is apparently the way crossing guards were brought in and used and trained has changed in the last year or two for the school district. And there was concern that some of the crossing guards aren't been trained properly to protect the students. So we'll look at some of the policies regarding that, as well as what's the best way to cross. And is flashing lights still appropriate, or there's other options of flashing lights called rapid flashing rectangular rapid flashing beacons. Now, as an alternative, they're more visible. So, the second theme that we saw was pedestrians. Again, the crosswalk locations. What's the best kind of crosswalk to have in terms of a consistent design? And there's also issues with other users, bicyclists on the sidewalk, interfering with pedestrians. It's not on this, it wasn't on this list, but one person had complaints about people walking their dogs, taking up the whole walkway, things like that. But from that, we're going to, again, assess the pedestrian crossings. A lot of that will overlap with the school crossings and on from there. Bike transportation, again, explore more opportunities and how we use the bike lanes on the road. Educate drivers and bicyclists. That was probably the biggest bike-related comments were, why don't the bicyclists observe traffic rules, and then the bicyclists will say, why don't the drivers observe traffic rules? So probably some education would be recommended within the village, as well as selective enforcement to help get people understand the best way to drive, to share the road together. Streets were a big factor. Again, I didn't list them all here, but a number of locations, some of them Bill related to along the Oakland Capital Corridor, Kensington was mentioned, Morris was mentioned a lot, in areas both in terms of roadway capacity, safety. They've identified, a number of streets, in not only the big ones, but some of the smaller ones for cut-through traffic, and ways that we can help alleviate that. Also, again, one of the big things, especially by the high school, was why aren't the drivers observing the stop signs and yield signs? And we're going to look at best practices to help increase compliance, whether it's through better visibility of the traffic control device or maybe selective enforcement, as well as general education. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, again, traffic at around the Metro Market and Walgreens. Bill touched on that. Several people brought up the issue of U-turns on Capitol at Morris. Apparently, the major issue is people exiting culverts, they can only make a right turn out, and then they go to Morris because they want to go back to the west, so they make a U-turn. And that's where we have students crossing. That touches on the pedestrian. Also, there's people making a right turn from Morris onto Capitol, so who goes first? And there's some issues there, so we're going to take a look at that, whether it's we ban the U-turns or we provide, no right turn on red on Morris. There's other options we can consider. And then Morris Boulevard, as I mentioned, was brought up a number of times, regarding both congestion and cut through. throughout the day. The people who spoke really felt that Morris should be a collector type road, that the way it's acting. I'm not sure we're going to eliminate all the traffic, but we'll look at ways to help mitigate some of the traffic volumes out there. And then last but not least, we're not necessarily redesigning or recommending changes to the bus system, but several people were very concerned that they don't want us to eliminate bus stops as part of our potential changes we may make at certain locations, as well as they're looking for recommendations regarding either benches or shelters during the adverse weather at some of the major bus stops. And then last but not least, one person was really pushing for a village-wide streetcar service. So and to supplement the regional bus transportation to provide more access throughout the village. So we'll take just a very general look at that. Our focus is not necessarily public transportation, but if there's some opportunities and the best practices that we can find from a couple other communities that may be representative, we'll present those as ideas.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Steve. One of the other noteworthy items that was brought up is the additional areas of interest for wayfinding and signage and village branding. Now, the village branding is outside of our scope, but looking at the wayfinding and signs and at least commenting on consistency, location, that's something that we will do. We want to make sure that any improvements are complemented with information to help people identify and the choices and use the parking appropriately. We're not out to increase citations, but actually, improve access and improve the level of service and the quality of life. And so sometimes just a little bit of information placed properly can alleviate anxiety and improve access. So we'll be looking at that as well. Moving on here, I want to go through a few more items, and we can circle back if there are any questions, but I just want to talk about the format of our next town hall meeting, and as well I'm going to speak briefly about the focus groups. What we would ideally like to do is have our focus groups between the second and third town hall meeting. So that means occurring between July 30th and August 29th. And we want to do the town hall meetings before school gets back in session. We do have representatives from the schools, and we want to be respectful of their commitments. So we do have sufficient number of potential participants in the focus groups. So the next step is to organize them into the 5 categories that we had identified. And over a period of 2 days, we'll be meeting with, the residential parties, whether it's multifamily and single. Those will be 2 separate. We're also going to be looking to meet with businesses, and then we're going to do a transportation and mobility focus group, and that's going to include pet safety. There'll be representatives from the schools. There'll be a mixture within that group. And then we're going to meet with the elected officials and staff. So those 5 meetings will occur over 2 days. And the format for this next town hall meeting coming up, it's going to be similar to what we did for the first one. However, it'll focus on parking, and we're going to be asking questions of the group. We're going to have them interact and respond to those questions. And specifically diving deeper than what we did on the first meeting. And even further with the focus groups, we'll be getting even further in depth, and we'll be using tools such as mobile app, digital response to survey questions. So as we're talking, questions will be coming up and they can respond to those. And we'll have immediate feedback to the focus group on what their preferences are, what their concerns are. But in the town hall meeting, we need to stay out of the weeds, but yet get deep enough that we make sure everybody feels heard and we're asking good questions that continue to help shape policy recommendations. Let's look at the agenda here. The timeline for the third town hall meeting, it's on August 29th. The time is to be determined. We'll work with Bart to identify that. Some other housekeeping items that we'll need to do with the focus groups. We're going to have to make sure we get the participants for each category locked down and proper invitations sent out to them. Typically what we see is about a 2-week window between the invitations being sent out and the meeting occurring. I think that's probably sufficient, but Bart, you can notify me if
That's fine.
Is that all right? Great.
Yep.
And location will either be at the library or in the meeting where you guys are at today. We want to make sure that it's an environment that's comfortable for all. We're going to be using, like as I mentioned, some digital tools, so we'll need a screen as well as we'll have our mobile capabilities. That's it for me right now, Bart. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I don't know if we want to go back to the summary of the first meeting just to make sure that everyone understood what was heard and whether or not they have any response or questions or maybe things that were missing, just briefly, because we do have a great representation of various stakeholder groups here, so I guess I'll just open it up to if anyone thinks anything. Sure, Erica, you want to start?
I have a few questions and comments. Are you taking into consideration that the signal actuator system is turned off? I mean, where the pedestrians push the button, it's timed right now, they don't work actually. So I don't know if you're factoring that in.
On Capitol.
On
Capitol Drive.
Yes,
was
Capitol
turned
Drive
off
only.
when they did after they implemented it.